Okay, welcome to part 4 of the Icon FJ44 Scale Replica series. In this video, I'll be working on the mid to rear section of the chassis, focusing on getting the balance of the suspension and the crossmembers in place, and eventually getting to these body mounts. So you saw me making these in the intro. It's made from simple aluminum stock, and it's available at hardware stores, some automotive suppliers. It's aluminum channel, and after carving away, I ended up with these two different size mounts. The smaller one is at 45 degrees, and the larger one is at 25 degrees. Okay, so the larger ones are for the front of the chassis here, and the 45s are going to get mounted here and back here. And right here, as you can see in the reference image, I made these very similar brackets out of brass, and they'll attach to the top of the chassis here. And later on, the rubber body mounts will be bolted to them. Out back, you can see that I have the angled supports in place. They allow the rearmost crossmember to be attached, and it gives the frame way more structure. And these pieces, they're rectangular brass stock. They're cut at 45 degrees, the tab's bent over, there's a hole drilled in either end, and they bolt to the chassis with 1/72 brass hardware. The temporary rear crossmember was made from 22mm aluminum C-channel, and about 7mm of this has been trimmed away. This ends up giving me a temporary crossmember. It lets me plan locations for straps for the fuel cell and other things on the way. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to get these soldered in. I'm going to solder these in, but only on this side. The solder will hold them here where it's plated and where it's bolted together. Back here, we'll still be able to remove this. Again, this is temporary. The final crossmember actually provides a foundation for the taillights, and it hangs out a fair ways past the frame rails. I'll have an opportunity to replace this later on. Okay, so while the primer is drying on the chassis, I thought I'd show you what's going on with the rear axle and some of the components I've built so far. For the first part, I've made one of the limiting straps. They're fun, they're easy to make, and they're just parts collected from a 5-point harness kit made by Yeah Racing. Next are the bump stop pads. I made it from that same 22mm C-channel. I cut out 3/4 of a circle, a tab, drilled a hole, and followed up with a bunch of filing to clean it up. I also have the tabs for the limiting straps, and these tabs are just made from Tamiya mounts. They're trimmed up, and I've just cut away one of the mounting holes. They're a plated steel, and I think these will be a lot stronger than an aluminum mount would be. I just thought that this metal would take a little bit more abuse if this truck ever sees it. Alright, so I thought I'd show you guys how these go together. For now, I'm just using basic 3mm hardware. They're just a little bit longer than the last ones to compensate for the extra material. If you've been watching the series, you may remember I mentioned that these lower link mounts would end up being home to a few accessories. These are two of them, and later on, there's a good chance I'll add a bracket to hold the brake lines as they make their way out to the calipers. So the bolt, it just passes through the tab, through the bump stop pad, and into the axle. Right, so our pads are here, our two tabs for our straps. These pads will eventually have a rubber bushing between themselves and the axle housing, so if they do get knocked around later on, between that and all the Loctite, it should take at least a slight impact and still stay true. So this is pretty much buttoned up and ready to go into the truck. I just have to build the second strap. Okay, the frame is dry. It's cured for a couple days. I didn't get to film any of the spraying sequence putting the primer on because it was so cold inside this garage the other night. I had to spray it really quick and then take it inside to the utility room to get some heat on it. But it's dry now, it's got a couple good coats on it, and the back end is sitting in place. The limiting straps are in, and now I'm trying to decide what to do with the calipers. I'm trying to use a caliper set from a Tamiya touring car. I think it's a TA05, and they normally run bearings in them, and they made up with the hub of the car. But I'm cutting all of that extra material off. I'm gradually trimming away tabs and trimming the housing off, and eventually ending up with something that looks like this. It'll mount to the 2 screws on the front of the axle housing. I'm going to make some brackets, and hopefully the caliper will hover around the rotor without binding. So much like the real thing, there's smaller calipers in the rear, larger ones in the front, and I'm really hoping this works. I'm really trying to keep these components in brass and aluminum. I'm just trying to keep as much metal on this thing as I can. Anyways, I just thought it'd be neat to show you guys some of my plans for the brake system moving forward. Okay, so I've got the sleeve in. It's a piece of ABS or styrene tube. It's exactly the right outer diameter to fit snugly inside the torsion tube. It's also the correct inner diameter to receive this piece of spring steel. This is from my very first SRB buggy restoration. If you guys know my builds, you'll probably remember that I always like to use something that's vintage. Anyways, I slide in the spring steel, and the torsion bar arms attach here with 2 grub screws. For those of you that may have noticed that this truck is riddled with mismatched hardware, it's just temporary from mock-up. I will be going around and replacing everything with this really nice zinc-plated hardware from Locked Up RC. They look like scale bolts, and I think once this thing is painted and all this stuff is on here, it will make a huge difference with the truck. Also, these sway bars and links will change. The sway bars themselves will be trimmed down so they look a little bit more like the ones on the Icon. Also, the end links will be changed to metal as soon as I figure something out. It'll provide way more clearance between the chassis and the swing arm, and it will look cooler as well. Okay, there's nothing like drilling holes in brand new stuff, so now I have to remove this bearing, drill a hole here in order to change the direction of this output shaft so it comes out the front of the transfer case. Sorry I didn't film the surgery, but I didn't want to risk focusing on other things and mess up drilling through the side of this case. Having to ship another one in holiday season, the extra cost, I just didn't want to risk it. But I did get it drilled, I'm able to flip the shaft, and now the RC 4-wheel drive Triton case has the same layout as the reduced ratio hammer case that I was using in the last video. Okay, now that I got my transfer case figured out, the outputs are right on it. Right through the middle and out to the back. Okay, so much like the one-to-one world, not everything works the first time, every time. So this transfer case, it's just a bit wider, so these output shafts sit a little further over to one side. This in turn forces the transmission to be offset, and that is no good. It needs to be dead center. So now I may have to shave off a little bit out of the inside of this frame rail. I'll have to modify this crossmember. I'll have to get this moved over a little bit. I may also be able to grab a few millimeters here and there by clocking the transfer case a bit. I have to be careful though. I don't want to give up any ground clearance by having it hang down lower. I'm also getting a little bit of rub out of the front drive shaft, so I may have to make some adjustments to the crossmember that passes underneath the back of the transmission. The really good news is that I have 2 steel drive shafts in. The ratio is right between front and rear. I'm no longer overdriving the front end of this truck, and I still end up with this realistic transfer case in the center. So far, I think it has a nice clean look, and I'll probably address the balance of these little issues in the next video. But for now, I'm running out of time, I'm running out of voice, and I'm tired, so I'm also running out of patience. That's it.